You said 6 months.
I changed my mind.
You can't do that!
Watch me.
This was a contract marriage.
Not anymore.
You're trapping me!
No.
Then what is this?
Me refusing to lose my wife.
I was never your wife.
Then why does it feel like you're already mine?
If you've ever wondered what happens when a deal meant to save a life becomes the one thing that changes everything, stay with this story. Because May didn't sign that contract to fall in love. She signed it to survive. And what happened next nobody saw coming. 3 months earlier, the hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and broken prayers. Imadose stood outside Ward 7 with her back pressed against the wall. Her fingers curled so tightly around the strap of her bag that the skin over her knuckles had gone pale. Through the small rectangular window in the door, she could see her brother Emeka lying in the bed, tubes running into his arm, chest rising and falling in shallow intervals, a monitor beside him drawing green lines that looked too flat, too quiet, too close to nothing. He was 22 years old. He had a laugh that filled rooms. He had a poster of Ronaldo on his bedroom wall, and a notebook full of engineering sketches that he'd been working on since he was 14. He called her sis with a particular kind of warmth, the kind that made the word sound like a promise. And he was dying. Miss Osei. The doctor's voice was not unkind. That almost made it worse. We've spoken about this before, but I have to be very clear with you today. The procedure cannot be delayed past Friday. The clot is growing. If we don't operate within 72 hours, the damage to the surrounding tissue becomes irreversible. I understand, Imade said. Her voice was level. She had trained it to be. The outstanding balance is 500,000 naira. Without it. I said I understand. The doctor looked at her the way people look at someone standing at the edge of something. Then he nodded and walked away, his shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. Imade didn't move for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and stared at her balance. 43,000 naira. 3 rejected loan applications in the last 2 weeks. Her landlord had already taken the small savings she'd been building since January. Her mother was in Benin with nothing to spare. Her father had left when Emeka was 4, and had not left a forwarding address. There was no one left to call. She pushed off the wall, walked to the end of the corridor, sat on a plastic chair, and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. She was not going to cry here. She had cried last night, alone in her one-room apartment with the ceiling fan turning slowly and her brother's engineering notebook on the table in front of her. She had given herself 30 minutes and then she had washed her face and made a plan. The plan had failed. She would make another one. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't answer. But the number was unfamiliar and something made her press the green button. Miss Imade Osei? The voice on the other end was a woman's. Professional. Precise. Yes. My name is Suyan. I work for a private consultancy. I'm reaching out on behalf of a client who has a time-sensitive arrangement he'd like to discuss with you. He's willing to meet tonight if you're available. Imade frowned. What kind of arrangement? A pause. The kind that pays 500,000 naira up front. The plastic chair felt suddenly very still beneath her. Who is your client? His name is Junseo Han. He's the CEO of Hancor Holdings. Imade had heard the name. Everyone in Lagos business circles had heard the name. Hancor had bought 3 commercial properties in Victoria Island in the last 18 months. The man behind it was Korean, young, and according to every article she'd ever skimmed past, entirely without warmth. What does he want? She asked. Another pause, shorter this time. A wife. The restaurant was in Ikoyi. The kind of place where the lighting was low and the prices weren't listed because if you needed to see the prices, you couldn't afford to be there. A man in a suit met Imade at the entrance and led her through the room without a word, past tables of quiet conversation, to a private booth near the back. Junseo Han was already sitting. He looked exactly like his photographs except somehow colder. Late 30s, lean, dark-suited, with a kind of stillness that didn't feel like calm so much as containment. His jaw was set, his eyes were evaluating, and when she sat down across from him he did not smile. Miss Osei. His English was precise, the accent measured. Mr. Han. I'll be direct. I need a woman to present as my wife for a period of 6 months. The arrangement is entirely contractual. It involves public appearances, cohabitation at my residence, and a convincing performance of a functional marriage to specific parties, my board and my family. At the end of 6 months we file for divorce. In return, I will pay you 500,000 naira upon signing, and an additional 300,000 at the end of the term. Imade looked at him. Why me? You were vetted. You have no public profile that would attract complications. You're educated, articulate, and you have a reason to need the money quickly. He paused. My consultant is thorough. You investigated me. I selected you. She held his gaze. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Why do you need a wife? She asked. Something moved behind his eyes. Just for a second. Then it was gone. That's not part of the arrangement. It is for me. The silence stretched. Then he said, there's a clause in my grandfather's founding charter for Hongkor. The CEO must be married to hold voting majority on the board. My grandfather was traditional. He built the company on the assumption that a married man was a stable man. The charter hasn't been removed. He picked up his water glass, studied it, set it down. I turn 38 next month. 2 of my board members have been waiting for years to use that clause against me. So you need a wife to keep your company. I need a wife for 6 months. Imade sat with that for a moment. Outside the booth, a waiter passed with a silver tray. Somewhere across the room, a woman laughed softly at something her companion said. I have conditions, Imade said. Something that almost resembled respect shifted in his expression. Speak. I want the money transferred to the hospital directly, not to me. Tonight. Before I sign anything. Done. I want weekly reports on my brother's medical progress sent to my phone. I want access to his doctors. Done. I don't share a bed. I have 12 bedrooms. That won't be a problem. And when this ends, she held his gaze, it ends completely. No contact. No complications. That is the point of a contract, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, patient, still unreadable as stone. She picked up the pen. The mansion was in Lekki Phase 1, behind a wall that was taller than anything it needed to be, with a gate that opened silently like it had been told to behave. Imade arrived the next morning with a single rolling suitcase, and the particular expression of someone who has decided not to feel things they cannot afford to feel. Suyan met her at the door. The interior was all clean angles and expensive silence. White marble, low furniture, art on the walls that probably had names she'd never heard. A staircase curved upward on the left like the spine of something architectural and proud. Junseo was standing at the far end of the entrance hall, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid Korean. He glanced at her arrival the way a man glances at a clock, acknowledging, functional, brief, and then turned away to continue his call. Suyan showed her to a room on the second floor. Large windows, a bed dressed in white linen, a private bathroom tiled in gray stone. It was the nicest room Imade had ever stood in, and she felt nothing about that because feeling things about it would cost energy she didn't have. Suyan set a folder on the dresser. The contract details. His schedule for the week. Your first public appearance is Thursday. A dinner with 2 board members and their wives. The story is that you met in London 18 months ago while he was at a conference. You were working at a trade consultancy. You dated quietly and married privately 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Imade repeated. Yes. The timeline needs to be recent enough to explain the surprise but long enough to suggest seriousness. Suyan paused. He'll brief you himself on specifics before Thursday. After she left, Imade sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the folder. Then she looked at her phone. A message had come through from the hospital 2 hours ago. Payment received in full. Surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the mattress. She pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed. Her brother was going to live. That was the only thing that was real right now. Everything else, the marble floors, the contract, the cold man downstairs, was just the price of that realness. She could pay it. He found her in the kitchen at midnight. She hadn't been able to sleep. Her brother's surgery was 7 hours away and her mind was doing the thing it always did in the dark. Cycling through every possible bad outcome with a thoroughness that felt almost deliberate, like her brain was trying to punish her for not having a better plan earlier. She was making tea, standing at the wide kitchen island in her sleepwear, when she heard footsteps and turned to find Junseo in the doorway in a dark shirt and loose trousers, looking like a man who also hadn't slept. They looked at each other. I'll go, she said. You don't have to. She stayed. He crossed to the refrigerator, opened it, stood studying its contents with the blank consideration of a man who wasn't actually hungry but needed something to do. He took out a bottle of water and closed the door. "Surgery is tomorrow morning," she said. She didn't know why she said it. "I know." He paused. "He'll be fine. The surgeon is Kim's referred team. They're the best working in Lagos right now." She stared at him. "You chose the surgical team?" He looked at the water bottle. "Soohyun handles logistics." That's not an answer. He didn't give her one. He set the water bottle on the counter, looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't name behind his eyes, and then walked back out of the kitchen. A maid stood there with her tea going warm. The clock above the stove read 12:17 a.m. She didn't know what to do with that. Thursday came. The dinner was at a rooftop restaurant in Victoria Island with a view of the Lagos waterfront and a table of 8 that included 2 board members, Director Choi and Director Park, their respective wives, and a woman a maid quickly understood was Jun Seo's primary observer of the evening. His mother. Young Hee-han had flown in from Seoul without announcement, according to the look on Soohyun's face when she delivered the update 2 hours before the dinner. She was 70, elegant, draped in navy silk, with eyes that had spent decades learning how to assess people and had gotten very good at it. She looked at a maid the way you look at a door that has appeared in a wall where no door should be. "You're Nigerian," she said at the table. Not a question. Barely even an observation. More like a verdict. "Yes," a maid said. Her smile was pleasant and did not waver. "Jun Seo has never mentioned Africa. I suppose he's private about some things." She reached across the table and touched his hand, the way they'd agreed, natural, casual, married. "Aren't you?" Jun Seo looked at her. There was something in his eyes that wasn't in the script. Something that lasted half a second longer than it should have before he said, smoothly, "Always." His mother's gaze moved between them like a searchlight. Director Choi leaned forward. "How did you two meet?" "London," Jun Seo said. "A conference," a maid added. "He sat next to me at a panel on emerging market infrastructure and told me my questions were better than the speakers." "Were they?" Director Park's wife asked, charmed. "Significantly," Jun Seo said. A maid glanced at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was almost not quite but almost warm. Calibrated for the audience, she reminded herself. This was the performance. This was what she'd been paid for. She smiled at Director Park's wife and reached for her wine glass. Under the table, she felt Jun Seo's hand settle over hers, just for a moment. Not for the audience. No one was looking. She didn't pull away. She also didn't look at him. The weeks that followed built themselves into a strange, careful architecture. They had a routine without having agreed to one. Breakfast at separate times, but coffee always made for 2. She'd noticed his cup on the counter 3 mornings in a row before she realized he was the one making it. Evenings were usually work, each of them in different parts of the enormous house, but sometimes she'd pass the study and see him at his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, working with an intensity that looked almost like pain. She'd learned not to knock unless it was necessary. He'd learned, she thought, that she didn't like being spoken to before 8 a.m. She visited Emeka twice a week. He was recovering well, better than the doctors had initially projected. He was already arguing with the nurses about when he could sit up, which the attending physician had told her with a smile was a very good sign. "Who paid for this place?" Emeka asked her one afternoon, looking around the private recovery ward with its large windows and quiet staff. "I did," a maid said. He looked at her with his familiar too perceptive eyes. "How?" "I got a contract job." "What kind of contract job, sis?" "The kind that pays well." She adjusted his blanket with crisp efficiency. "Rest." He caught her wrist gently. "Are you okay?" She looked at her little brother. His face still thinner than it should be. His eyes still more tired than she liked, but alive, present, arguing with nurses and asking questions and entirely undeniably there. Her chest did something complicated. "I'm fine," she said. "Go to sleep." It was Soohyun unintentionally who broke it open. A maid had been looking for a document, a public appearance schedule for the following month, and had gone to Soohyun's office on the ground floor when she heard voices inside. The door was slightly open. She'd raised her hand to knock and then heard her own name and paused. If she files before the 6 months, the board can still invoke the clause. A man's voice. A lawyer, she thought. She won't file. In. But if she does, or if the marriage appears to be breaking down publicly, it won't. Soo-yeon. The lawyer's voice was careful. The inheritance transfer is tied to the marriage standing. If the board declares the marriage invalid or calls an emergency vote before his birthday, he loses the majority stake. Not just the CEO position, everything his grandfather built for him personally. The family branch in Busan has been waiting for this opening for years. I'm aware. Does she know that? Silence. Maid lowered her hand from the door. She stood in the corridor and listened to her own heartbeat. Then she turned and walked back upstairs slowly, one step at a time, because her legs felt like they'd been filled with something heavy and unmoving. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window. So that was it. It wasn't just the board. It was the inheritance. It was everything. She wasn't just a wife on paper. She was the wall between Jun Seo-han and losing everything his grandfather had spent a lifetime building for him. She was leverage. She was a lock on a door. She was a tool dressed up in nice clothes and taught to smile at directors and their wives. The tea he'd left. The surgical team. The way he placed his hand over hers at the table. All of it choreography. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through it. She found him in the study that evening. She knocked this time. He looked up from his desk. Something in her expression made him go very still. You should have told me, she said. He watched her. The inheritance. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. The family in Busan. The fact that this marriage isn't just about a board clause. It's about everything. Your grandfather's legacy. The entire estate. She paused. I wasn't just a solution, was I? I was a shield. The room was quiet. Outside, Lagos moved in its distant, unceasing way. Horns, generators, the city that never decided whether it was sleeping or awake. Junseo set down his pen. He looked at the desk for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Yes, he said. The word landed like something dropped from a height. That's all you have, she said. You asked for the truth. I asked you 3 weeks ago why you needed a wife, and you said it wasn't part of the arrangement. I was wrong to say that. She stared at him. There was no deflection in his voice, no scrambling, no performance. Just that flat, steady acknowledgement. It almost made it worse, how easy it was for him to admit it without breaking. You picked me because I needed the money badly enough not to ask too many questions, she said. He didn't deny it. And the surgical team? Was that? She stopped. Was that before I signed? The silence that followed told her everything. She laughed. Not a warm laugh. Something brittle and short. You paid for my brother's surgery before I agreed. Before I had any leverage. Why? He stood up from behind the desk. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the lit compound. Because you were going to say yes regardless, he said quietly. You didn't have any other option. And I didn't want the money to be the reason you signed. She opened her mouth, closed it. You wanted me to choose, she said slowly. Even though you knew I had no choice. I wanted you to feel like you did. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It isn't. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the shape of him at the window, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to standing alone in quiet rooms with the weight of large things pressing down on him. Then she said, I need some air, and walked out. She didn't come down to breakfast for 2 days. On the third morning, she found coffee already made and a note beside it. It said, in his precise handwriting, the surgeon called. Your brother can begin physiotherapy next week. He's ahead of schedule. She stood at the counter and looked at the note for a long time. Then she poured the coffee and drank it. The problem was that she'd started noticing things she hadn't meant to notice. The way he looked at reports versus the way he looked at his grandfather's photograph. The one on the shelf beside the study window. An old man with a wide smile and a suit that didn't fit quite right. He'd caught her looking at it once and said without her asking. He built the first Hongkor warehouse with 11 employees and a lease he couldn't afford. He used to say the only difference between a businessman and a fool is that the businessman is afraid and goes anyway. He hadn't looked at her while he said it. He'd looked at the photograph. The way he handled his mother's phone calls, standing very still in the garden, voice low and patient, never defensive, never warm, Just enduring in the way of someone who has accepted a particular kind of loneliness as the cost of being who he is. The way once she'd come down at 2 a.m. to find him in the kitchen not making anything, just sitting at the island with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes closed. And when she asked if he was all right, he'd opened his eyes and looked at her like she was an unexpected light in a room he'd expected to stay dark and said, "I'm fine," in a voice that wasn't convincing and somehow didn't seem to need to be. She noticed these things. She cataloged them the way you catalog problems you're trying not to solve. She was 40 days into a 6-month contract. She had 80 left. She told herself that daily. The gala was Hongkor's annual investor event, 300 people, a waterfront venue, international press. It was the largest stage the marriage had been required to perform on, and Soo-yeon had spent 2 weeks preparing for it with the thoroughness of a general planning a campaign. Maid wore deep burgundy. Her hair was up. She'd been told by 3 different people on the way in that she looked stunning and had said thank you each time with the automatic ease of someone who'd trained herself to receive compliments like traffic. You acknowledge them, you let them pass, you keep moving. Jun Seo found her near the window at the edge of the main hall, looking out at the water. He'd been across the room in conversation with investors for the last 40 minutes and she'd felt, distantly, his occasional glance, finding her the way you glance at something you're trying not to stare at. "You're doing well," he said quietly, arriving beside her. "I'm standing next to a window. You're making 14 people in this room believe I have the kind of stability that warrants their investment." He was looking at the water too. "That's not standing. That's work." She looked at him sideways. "My mother called this afternoon," he said. "She said," he stopped. "What did she say?" "She said you reminded her of someone." "Who?" He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother. The one my grandfather built the warehouse for." He paused. "She said it wasn't a compliment." A maid laughed. A real one, before she could stop it. He looked at her, and something happened in his expression that she couldn't fully read but recognized as rare. "I'll take it," she said. He almost smiled. 58 days in, something shifted. She couldn't point to the exact moment. It was the accumulation of small things, the coffee, the notes, the late nights in separate rooms that somehow felt like the same room. The way he said her name when he needed her attention, quietly, like he was trying not to startle her, like he knew she was always slightly braced for something difficult. She sat with Emeka on a Saturday afternoon, watching him move carefully on his physiotherapy exercises, strong and improving and irritatingly cheerful about it. "Tell me about this contract job," he said. "Emeka." "Because I did some research." He looked at her with those 2 sharp eyes. "Hongkor Holdings bought the building your company used to rent. A month before you stopped mentioning money problems." A maid said nothing. "Are you married, sis?" The word landed in the afternoon quiet between them. "It's complicated," she said. "Are you okay?" She looked at her brother, recovered, whole, present, asking her the same question he always asked, the question she always deflected. She thought about Jun Seo at the window of his study. She thought about the surgical team chosen before she'd signed. She thought about the way he'd said, "I wanted you to feel like you did," in the voice of someone confessing something they hadn't meant to confess. "I think so," she said. "I'll tell you everything when I understand it better." He nodded like that was enough because he knew her, and knew that was the most she gave. She tried to end it on the evening of day 64. Not end the contract, she had no grounds for that. But something had grown in her chest over the last 2 weeks that she recognized with the same alarm she'd felt watching Emeka's monitor in the hospital. It was something she couldn't afford. Something that would cost her in ways she hadn't budgeted for. She found Jun Seo in the garden. The Lego sky was doing the thing it did in the wet season. Deep purple and warm orange held together in a way that shouldn't work. "I need us to be clearer," she said. "About what this is." He looked at her. "We've been..." She searched for the right word. "There's been a drift in how we exist in this house. And I think it's because we've both stopped treating it like what it is." "And what is it?" he asked. "A contract." He looked at the sky for a long moment. Then he said, "What if I told you I'd like it to be something else?" She felt her heartbeat do something complicated. "Then I'd tell you that's not what we agreed. Agreements can change. Not this one." She held his gaze. "Because I'm not." She stopped. Started again. "I don't know who you are outside of this arrangement. I don't know if the man who chose the surgical team is real or if he's the performance. I don't know which version of you I've been living with. He was quiet for a long time. The city hummed behind the walls. Then he said, they're the same man. She didn't answer. She walked back inside. She found out about the extension on a Tuesday. Soo-yeon called her into the downstairs office with the expression of a woman delivering news she'd have preferred to give differently. Mr. Han filed an amendment to your contract 3 weeks ago, she said. The 6-month term has been extended. The room went very still. Extended how long? A maid asked. Indefinitely. With a minimum additional term of 6 months. He can't do that without my signature. Soo-yeon slid a document across the desk. A maid looked at it. Looked at the signature line. Looked at the date. This is my signature, she said slowly. This is, she stopped. She looked at Soo-yeon. The 3rd week. When I signed the revised public appearance schedule. Soo-yeon's expression was answer enough. The revised schedule that she'd skimmed and signed because she'd been running late for Emika's physiotherapy appointment, and Soo-yeon had said it was just scheduling. She stood up from the chair. Where is he? She said. She found him in the entrance hall, jacket on, ready to leave for a board meeting. He saw her face and stopped. You amended the contract, she said. The room held its breath. Yes, he said. You buried it in a scheduling document. He said nothing. You said you wanted me to feel like I had a choice. Her voice was very controlled. And then you took the one choice I had left. A maid. You said 6 months. She took a step toward him. You gave me your word. I know. Then why? The question filled the hall, bounced off the marble and the high ceiling and the expensive silence, and landed between them like something raw and exposed. Jun Seo looked at her. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked unguarded. Not performing. Not contained. Just a man who had done something he couldn't take back and was standing in the consequence of it. Because I can't let you go, he said. The words were quiet. They had the weight of things said after a long time of not being said. A maid stared at him. The anger was still there, real and justified, but beneath it something else was pressing upward. Something she'd spent 68 days keeping carefully below the surface, and she hated him a little for making it difficult to stay angry. That's not your decision, she said. I know. This isn't love. Her voice broke slightly on the last word and she hated that too. This is control. This is you using the same leverage you've been using from the beginning, the money, the contract, Then why? He said, and his voice was rougher now, not smooth, not calibrated. Does losing you feel like death? The hall went completely silent. She looked at him, this man who had walked into her desperation with a pen and a price and a reason that turned out to be bigger than he'd admitted. This man who made coffee for 2 and chose surgical teams in advance and stood alone in dark rooms with the weight of inheritances and grandfathers and loneliness pressing down on him. And she did not know what to do with what she felt. You violated my trust, she said finally. Again. Yes, she would make that choice herself. Whatever it cost. If this story kept you watching, you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next episode is coming. And this is only the beginning of what a maid and Jun Seo have to face.